We just keep getting hung up on the smallest of items, the cat umbrella.
Those I do want.
All of them?
Yes.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our October video essay here at The Financial Diet. And as you may be able to tell from the intro, today we are going to talk about the, to put it nicely, very unique era of consumerism we're currently living in. Now, as I like to do sometimes on this channel, I'm gonna go ahead and quickly throw to myself to set us up on this topic. I have to say that a lot of those restocking videos that come across my feed honestly give me the same feeling as an episode of Hoarders. And I feel like the only difference in the level of completely unhinged consumerism in those videos versus Hoarders is just organization and aesthetics. And listen, I grew up low income and went into credit card debt buying things I don't need to heal my inner child. I get how soothing it can be to have way too much. But I really do not think that we're experiencing the proper level of disgust when we see some of these organizing restocking videos. Where we're going to Costco on a weekly basis and buying hundreds and hundreds of single-use plastic items and then often putting them into other plastic containers. Where they go to make a coffee and they open up a drawer that has 50 different syrups and sprinkles and creamers. Or they have 30 different Stanley cups that coordinate with their outfits. And where everything is linked in their Amazon storefront or their TikTok shop. And this content is insanely popular on here, and when you go to the comments, they're usually positive or talking about how aspirational it is. And I am sorry, but that level of consumerism is mentally unwell. And again, just because it happens to be organized and aesthetically appealing does not mean it's not coming from a similar impulse to people who are hoarding old newspapers. And it just really blows my mind that on one side we're totally aware of how unhealthy it is, and on the other side we consider it aspirational content. We need to get a grip. Now, to some of you, it might feel extreme to look at some of the images of hyperconsumption that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis and be reminded of a popular reality show about people who are suffering from pretty severe mental illness. But I think, and I think after watching this video, you also might think, that many of the same impulses and cultural reinforcements are underlying both situations. Someone opening up a cupboard to show dozens of different Stanley cups with all kinds of accessories and modifications for each one may look, at least aesthetically, very different from someone who has a cupboard full of dirty Tupperwares. But ultimately, it's a question of class, it's a question of aesthetics, it's a question of how we perceive aspiration, and perhaps most importantly, what we deem as enough, which in our current era basically doesn't exist. We're living in an era where a confluence of marketing and capitalism and social media have convinced us that we need more at all costs. In the words of Jerry Seinfeld,
more everything!
No matter the sacrifices that entails for our money or our mental health or the quality of the products that we're buying. We can sometimes fool ourselves into thinking that we live in an era of abundance because in some superficial ways that's true. But really, we are living in an era of excess. An era of having so much more than we need that we barely have time to enjoy what we have. As Americans, we've seen increased consumerism since the post-World War II period, when buying things was promoted as a way to support our economy and therefore to be patriotic. But in recent years, overconsumption has turned into full-blown hyperconsumption thanks to a lot of factors. The internet's ability to turn something local and specific into a must-have experience, finely tuned algorithmic marketing, in-app purchases in storefronts, and of course the outsourcing and exploitation of labor in lower cost of living countries. Now, fast fashion is an easy example to point to. Instead of fashion seasons that actually follow our seasons, we've started to have weekly micro seasons that have turned into real-time retail from brands like Shein or Temu, Pretty Little Things, or AliExpress, with social media trends dictating the launch of new pieces on a daily basis, if not even more frequently. And I would argue that we are repeating this model elsewhere, not just in fashion. For instance, we're constantly inventing new micro-holidays and ways to turn every life event into multiple celebrations. For example, you can no longer just have a baby, you have to plan a clever pregnancy announcement photo shoot, have a gender reveal party, have a baby shower that's totally a separate party, plan another announcement for the birth, share templatized photos of every weekly and monthly milestone with that little felt board, and also throw a 1-year-old's birthday party with a decor budget that rivals many weddings. And we are similarly constantly updating the new it places in a given city, or obsessing on how to maximize every experience. Plenty of musical artists, for example, are now following Taylor Swift's lead and not just releasing an album, but releasing multiple versions of the same record on vinyl, re-releasing existing content packaged in a new way, and creating concert experiences that encourage toxic levels of FOMO, but more on that later. And above all else, we have been conditioned to prioritize convenience over everything. In fact, convenience is so important to us that we're spending thousands of dollars on it per year. A Finder.com survey found that 74% of adults in the US spend $4,073 a year on conveniences like subscription boxes, food deliveries, and ride sharing. And that's not even taking into account other convenience expenses like same-day and two-day delivery services like Amazon Prime, or how convenience encourages consumer habits like purchasing a cute outfit you saw online directly through a storefront on an influencer's like to know. And still every day there's a new app or service meant to make our lives even more convenient than they already are, thus furthering the collective mindset that our financial and emotional well-being is a problem to solve on an individual level rather than a social one. Because, for example, why would we need to invest more in public transportation when we can just find new and exciting ways to make rideshare apps cheaper and more exploitative? Also, on the topic of convenience, our next month's video essay is all about convenience culture, which in our opinion is the dual head of the hydra that is consumer culture, and also taps into things that are taking over the rest of our lives, like the gig economy, the depression of wages, and so many other fun topics. So do come back for next month's video essay. Now, I also want to address, and we'll get into this more later in the video, that it's not just the messages being marketed to us that have put us in this position of endless hyperconsumption. It's also our own impulses. Now, first and foremost, as animals, we have instincts to hoard resources when they're available to us. And for the many Americans who grew up in some level of financial insecurity, that is exacerbated in part because we were raised with mental patterns to not know when the next resources would come. If things like basic necessities or food or clothing were not always predictable for you, it's of course going to be a lot more effective on your brain when you are being marketed these things and you at least temporarily have the ability to buy them. And as someone who personally went into credit card debt as a result of that tendency to overindulge when things were available, I can say firsthand just how much of these habits come from that fundamental position of scarcity being actively preyed on by all of these marketing systems. And going back to hoarders, I've watched a lot of episodes of that show, including several just in preparation for making this video. And what's so fascinating is when you watch the show, you see so many of the same stories from the people being profiled as the ones that, for example, we interview people all the time about on TFD for having gotten themselves into, for example, severe credit card debt. This tendency to hyper-consume, to fill ourselves up with things, often comes from core traumas and woundings that we aren't necessarily working through on an emotional behavioral basis. We're self-soothing with buying things, and we are constantly surrounded by companies who want to offer us more ways to do that more conveniently and effectively. To speak more on the topic of overconsumption and how it is infecting every part of our lives, we found the perfect person to speak to, someone who might be familiar to a lot of you, Paige Pritchard of Overcoming Overspending.
Shopping was very much tied to my emotions. Like, I noticed that was a time in my life where I was experiencing a lot of negative emotion. I, didn't handle, it was like I was coming out of college. I moved back in with my parents. Me and my boyfriend broke up. I hated my job. And so shopping was kind of like my light every day, right? It was like the glimmer that I had every day to kind of look forward to. And, I also kind of had this image in my head of what a corporate working girl should look like, right? Like what she should wear and how she should present herself and what that said about me being someone who was able to shop at these places that I had never been able to shop at. So you really kind of have to start digging deeper and doing some self-evaluation of what am I even trying to get at with my shopping and consumption? And then figure out other ways to give that to yourself that doesn't involve the stuff and the shopping and the buying.
And I don't make the comparison to shame us, but rather to understand that when we see that very aesthetically unappealing, scary looking behavior on shows like Hoarders, where people have rooms and rooms and rooms full of garbage and old collectibles and stuff they don't even remember buying, that it's not that different from the social media influencer who's done 50 hauls in as many weeks. who every day is showing off new outfits that she would have to live 10 lifetimes to be able to wear. Or the mukbanger who goes to a fast food restaurant, orders enough food to feed a family of 8, spreads it out like a cornucopia in front of the camera, and then eats it to the tune of millions of views. We think habits are better just because they happen to look better, but I would argue it's often just a question of management of symptoms. So let's start by getting into Chapter 1, the psychology of more. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of fast fashion and other hyperconsumption models, we first have to look at the psychology behind our spending habits. One big reason for our overconsumption is that as Americans, we are completely accustomed to that scarcity mindset we talked about. According to Michael Easter, a science journalist / professor and author of Scarcity Brain, we fall into what he describes as a scarcity loop. It consists of 3 parts. You start with an opportunity to get something of value, something that improves your life. In the case of a slot machine, it's money. Number 2 is that you have an unpredictable reward. You may get the thing of value at some point, but you don't know when, you don't know exactly how valuable it will be. And with the slot machine, it could be $1, it could be nothing, it could be $1 million. The third part is quick repeatability, meaning you can repeat the behavior immediately. The average slot machine player plays 16 games in a minute, which is about the same amount of times that we blink. The loop feeds itself. So when it comes to our mindless consumption, social media is a huge feeder of our scarcity loop. We see an item we like and feel we must have, like a skincare product or a pair of shoes or a perfectly aesthetically overstocked fridge, and we receive unpredictable rewards. For example, whether or not the purchases improve our lives. Then we scroll and see the next item that we must have, and we repeat the process. And it's the same reason that we get sucked into scrolling social media apps. We know when we are not actively getting anything out of it, but the possibility that we could come across something of value, even just to make us laugh, keeps us sucked in. And according to Easter, we're actually wired to work this way. Quote, "It's a natural human impulse that evolved to help us survive in the past when food and other things that we needed to live were scarce. And in that context, repeating the instinct to chase a reward like food kept you alive." But we also have to address how so much of marketing is based on exploiting these factors in a way that actively makes us less happy. Because marketing, when it works, gets us to buy more. But when we buy more in general, we are usually less happy. Quote, "The University of Warwick's Andrew Oswald and his team compared survey data on the life satisfaction of more than 900,000 citizens of 27 European countries from 1980 to 2011, with data on annual advertising spending in those nations over the same period. The researchers found an inverse connection between the two. The higher a country's ad spend was in one year, the less satisfied its citizens were a year or two later."
Like one of the key themes, if not the primary key theme of consumer culture, is that more is more, right? Like, and also that, and this is true for money and for stuff as well, that the more money that you have, and therefore the more stuff that you have that you can then buy with all of your money, the more valuable you are as a human being. And this isn't something that's like consciously taught to us, but it's just ingrained in us, and it's just everywhere. It's in movies, it's in TV shows, it's in media, it's in the books that we read, it's in, just society in general. We just live in a world that teaches us the more money you have and the more stuff that you can buy with that money, just the more valuable and worthy of a human being you are, which of course that touches a very like deep and core need for us as human beings, like to be included and valuable and worthy. And also just this notion of more is more, right? Like, I don't think a lot of us realize that there actually is a law of diminishing returns with our spending and consumption. Meaning, like, yes, like you going out and buying things and spending money to a degree and to an extent will make your life better. It'll meet your needs. It takes you out of survival mode. You don't have to be like stressing about like, oh my gosh, like how am I going to pay rent? And like you kind of get to that point where you have your needs met and you feel safe and secure. But we often just keep going past that point, right? We've experienced that spike in happiness, fulfillment, safety, security up until that point. And we just think it's a linear relationship. We just think like, oh, it's just going to keep going. So like, I'll just keep buying and consuming. And like my levels of happiness and fulfillment will continue to increase at the same level that they have been, not realizing that there's actually a peak to it. There's actually a really great personal finance book. It's called Your Money or Your Life by Vicki Robin and Joe Dominguez, which has this concept called the fulfillment curve. And that was one of the really most powerful theories for me to learn about, because again, the fulfillment curve is just, it's just like a hump. It's just a peak, which shows you that past a certain point, like once you reach enough insufficiency, once you go past that, any consumption, spending, buying you do past that point will actually start to bring down your happiness and fulfillment. And a lot of us don't realize that, right? Like a lot of us honestly have to live that out and experience that, like actually get to the point where your consumption starts to consume you and experience that on an individual level for then you to be like, wait a second, like what's going on here? Like what gives, right? Like I thought that if I bought all this stuff, I'd be happier. I did it. I'm not. And so that's when you kind of start to have that light bulb moment where you're like, oh, this actually isn't giving me what I thought it would give me.
And a new study led by psychologist Dr. Philipp Ozimek at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum in Germany found that social media-fueled materialism is contributing to our discontent. Quote, more than 1,200 participants who spent an average of 2 hours on social media per day completed a series of questionnaires designed to assess how materialism on social media is linked to life satisfaction. The results revealed that social media can lead to a downward spiral of anxiety and unhappiness, especially in those with a materialistic mindset. Materialistic individuals tend to use social media to compare themselves to others, and they run a greater risk of social media addiction. Because yes, more and more with each passing year and new generations coming into adulthood, we are living in a world in which our reality is filtered back to us through social media and our digital selves, and we are constantly comparing ourselves to people who, even just a few decades ago, we wouldn't have been aware existed. And this is happening at the same time as cost of living is skyrocketing, wages are stagnating, and so many of the big goalposts of adulthood and wealth building are basically entirely out of reach. But even just being aware of these other realities filtered through social media can cause us great anxiety and drive us to overspend on the things that we ultimately don't need. As our friend Erin Lowry wrote for Bloomberg back in February, this is a trend that's being called money dysmorphia. Quote, some 43% of Gen Z and 41% of millennials say they suffered from a flawed perception of their finances. According to a recent Credit Karma study, millennials and Gen Z keep hearing how tough we have it, how hard and expensive it is to buy a home, how much it costs to raise children and secure childcare, how big corporations, once seen as beacons for the young, ambitious people, are now slashing jobs. The challenges facing younger adults are real, but they can lead to an unhealthy narrative in someone's head that says the other shoe could drop at any moment. And adding to that anxiety are images on social media featuring people showing off luxury consumer goods, flying first class to expensive destinations, and dining in notoriously difficult to book restaurants. Younger consumers are inundated with this content. Essentially, it's not just the messages our own brain is giving us about our need to hoard resources and to overconsume when it's available to us. It's also the feeling of our current economic system and how out of touch building longer-term wealth and stability can be that leads us to lean even further into these relatively small financial joys. Because hey, you might never be able to retire, but you can drain your checking account on a spontaneous trip to Europe to go see a music artist whose tickets are somehow like a third the price over there. Essentially, it's not a surprise that millennials and Gen Z are wanting to spend in this way and are being convinced at every turn to do so, because essentially every industry is rising to this model of give them more, give it to them now, and at lower quality. But it would be pretty hard to debate that the ultimate example of this model in our current era still remains the fast fashion industry. Which brings us to Chapter 2. How fast fashion cheapened everything. As I mentioned earlier, as Americans, we've been consuming too much for decades, but the problem has only recently spun as out of control as it currently is. Because at the same time that we're buying more clothes than ever, we're spending a lot less on them than we used to. Quote, in the mid-20th century, the average American family spent about 10 to 12% of their household income on clothing. Today, that figure has dropped to around 3%, and it's not because people are buying less. The average person buys about 70 new apparel items a year, compared to approximately 25 items per person in 1960. So why are people spending so much less? Starting in the 1970s and into the 1990s, most US clothing production moved overseas, where labor costs are lower and production output is higher. Those savings were passed on to consumers, and as fast fashion brands proliferated, Americans had more options at lower prices than ever before. According to data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, on average, a woman's dress cost $50 in 1960. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $530 today. It's not unheard of, but it's far above prices for the most popular clothing retailers. Now, this revolution in how fashion is produced, how it's marketed, and how frequently it's bought is definitely in part a problem with production methods and with the sheer quantity of items that a lot of these companies are now producing. They are in many ways creating this demand. But we also have to be honest with ourselves that hyperconsumption of clothing is also being glamorized on a grassroots level, especially on social media. For one thing, plenty of celebrities will gladly shill for these super low-cost clothing brands even though they could easily afford to shop higher quality and more sustainably. And also, let's be honest, would likely never actually wear those clothes unless they were being paid to. And this is particularly upsetting when you consider the impact that people like celebrities and influencers have over consumer norms generally. If they were to turn down this money and to only align themselves with more sustainable, higher quality practices, it would undoubtedly have a huge impact on public perception. But the fact that even beloved pop artists are going to be wearing the same cheap fast fashion clothes that are marketed to people at 1/1000th of their income makes it more socially acceptable. Let's not forget that, quote, Katy Perry, Lil Nas X, Rita Ora, Hailey Bieber, and Yara Shahidi all represented Shein between 2020 and 2021. And fast fashion hauls are ubiquitous on social media. And even when the content itself is not explicitly about the act of shopping, for example, my haul from X season at Y store, which are extremely common, the idea of over-purchasing in order to show a range of options has become essentially the norm. For example, it's extremely common to see creators making videos about looking for an outfit for a particular event or occasion, and the way of doing that will be buying a ton of different options online, trying them on for the camera, and then sending back all but one. Even if these clothes do get repurchased, it's important to understand the environmental implications of just the logistics and reverse logistics alone. But again, the hyper abundance when it comes to clothing, wearing new outfits for every occasion, buying tons of things just to return all but one, having different looks for every day of a trip, all of this has become the new way in which we engage with apparel, rather than just a very recent time ago when buying 1 to 2 new items per season would be considered pretty luxurious.
The deal piece of it, right? Things being so cheap that we're like, oh my God, it's so cheap. This is such a good deal. It almost, like the girl math mentality behind it is like, it's basically free, right? Like, oh my God, this shirt's $10. Like it's basically free. And while I'm at it, I might as well get 3 of them instead of 1. I also think too, something else that plays into this that a lot of people don't think about is when the cheaper that something gets, the less your standards become for how good it has to be. And so you could find a piece of clothing where you're like, it's okay. Like, it's fine. It's good enough. Like, I don't love it, but it's like, it's fine. But the fact that it's only $10, like, sure, why not? And so not only are you tempted to spend more because on one hand, you're like, oh my God, this is such a good deal. It's so cheap. Let me get as many as I can. Your standards also for what you're buying, not even from like a quality perspective, which yes, of course, that is absolutely true. Quality is never as good, but just your own internal, like how much you like the item becomes so much less. So then what you're doing is you're filling up your life, you're filling up your closet or your space with all of these with so much more. That's just kind of like, okay, like you're like, it's fine. It's okay. And so that wears off. Like your desire for it or the allure of it or the excitement of it wears off so much quicker than if it's something that you're like, I love this.
And this is a side note, but one of the biggest trends we're seeing amongst young adults is the almost complete disappearance of things like going to the cobbler, going to the tailor, buying clothes of higher quality, and then investing in them long-term with small tweaks and repairs. I made a video about this recently, but for me, for example, I only ever buy jeans a size or two too big and then get them tailored because A, I find that it makes for a much greater fit, but B, it allows you to shop a lot more flexibly with the actual jeans, for example, buying secondhand denim, because you don't need to be as specific about the fit in the dressing room. And even if you were to argue that things like getting clothing tailored or repaired is expensive on its face, so is buying dozens of unnecessary fast fashion items. But only one of those two things is constantly being normalized on social media. And one, I think, underexplored reason for the absolute explosion of fashion hyperconsumption is the sheer amount of space that a lot of Americans are living in. Quote, "The average American house has doubled in size since the 1950s, and closet space in particular has increased, particularly with the advent of the walk-in closet in the 1980s. We likely have more than 5 times as many clothing items as we did in the first part of the 20th century." And there is no one exact policy or phenomenon that we can point to as the reason that we're all living in such hugely big spaces with so much storage. But there has been an overall trend in the past century in America to put Americans further away from each other in essentially their own mini castles. From a 2019 article in The Atlantic, quote, "The dictates of government have for the past century effectively steered Americans toward living in detached, single-family homes. A nation of homeowners, of people who own a real share in their own land, is unconquerable," Franklin D. Roosevelt said in 1942. Of course, it doesn't necessarily follow that a nation of homeowners must own big houses, but a slew of policies from the creation of the Federal Housing Administration in 1934 to the zoning mandates of individual towns and cities fueled the growth of suburbs and in turn the growth of the houses of which they were composed. And as the American family size continues to decline, these bigger and bigger houses aren't filled with people, they're filled with stuff. And because there's such a disparity between the amount of items we're expected to buy to fill these walk-in closets and the amount of money the average American is working with, the natural byproduct of this is credit card debt. Quote, "Americans have an enormous amount of credit card debt. Outstanding balances on credit cards reached a grand total of $1.12 trillion in Q1, up from 13.1% from the same time last year, according to data from the FRBNY. And 2023 was the first time outstanding credit card balances surpassed the $1 trillion mark. And another Bankrate survey found that 49% of credit card holders were carrying a balance from month to month in 2023. In some cases, Americans may be relying more on their credit cards as their finances are stretched thin, thanks to higher cost of everyday expenses and higher interest rates on credit and loans." Now, I don't want to blame the victim here because, as we've discussed, there is a huge amount of psychological and external factors bearing down on us to make us spend in this way. And if you spent all that money for a big standalone house full of walk-in closets, it's only natural to fill them with things. And when so much consumption is being normalized all around us, we can understand how people normalize it for themselves.
Part of the reason that I started my company a couple years ago was because when I was in my younger 20s, I actually really struggled with compulsive shopping. I actually shopped through an entire year's salary. It was my very first year after graduating from college. I had graduated with my degree. I was $40,000 in student loan debt, had no savings, got a job back in the town that I grew up in. And so I, had the privilege of moving back in with my parents for a year because, I was like, okay, like we're going to make some progress on these loans. We're actually going to get some money saved up while I can keep my expenses really low living at home. And essentially, fast forward to the end of that year, that is not what happened. I actually ended up shopping away my entire year's salary again during a time where I virtually had no expenses. And I mostly spent all of that money on clothes, accessories, basically anything that I could put on my body, right? So, like clothes, handbags, shoes, accessories, makeup, beauty, skin products. And I really kind of had this like wake up moment at the end of that year that I was like, okay, I can't keep spending my money like this or I'm going to be broke. But so while I didn't go into debt with my shopping definitely did hinder so much progress that I could have made towards other debt that I had, right? Towards student loan debt and towards not having any savings. It was definitely a long journey. I think that this is something that people don't realize is when you're changing your habits around consumption, it's great to start in the beginning with those quick fixes, which I can kind of talk through some of those, kind of like I call it elevating your environment, changing things in your external environment to support the changes that you're wanting to make. But I think also what we have to realize is even more important than that is recognizing that the world that we live in supports not only supports, but highly encourages and praises and rewards this type of behavior. And so where I started was first in my environment with really going through and putting kind of like some boundaries in place for myself around my spending and around my consumption. So one thing that I was doing a lot is I would shop on my lunch break. And so that's something that I always have people start with are like, what are your triggers? What are your spending or your shopping triggers? And triggers can be, like an email that you're getting, an ad that you're being served on social media, but triggers can also be, like the time of day. Like for me, it was like, oh, lunchtime rolled around. I was like, oh, I'm going to go shop. Like my coworkers would go to lunch and I would go up to the mall, right? Triggers can be, like you shop at night, you shop on your lunch break, you shop on the weekends. Triggers can be people, right? Like, do you have people in your life who you're like, she's my shopping friend, right? Like when we're together, we shop, or maybe it's a family member. So it really is kind of taking a holistic look in your environment around what are the things in my world that are just making the shopping and the consumption very quick, very easy, and very kind of enticing for me to engage in and put boundaries, around those things.
But as we know, it is not just in fast fashion that we are seeing this proliferation of more, now lower quality. It's filtering into every aspect of our consumer habits, including what goes into our bodies. Which brings us to our next chapter, Chapter 3. Mukbangs, how watching people eat became the new TV. Now, when it comes to spending, few categories have changed more radically between Gen Z/millennials and older generations of adults than how we spend on food. Quote, 40% of Gen Zers in the US and 39% of millennials are ordering more delivery compared to only 26% of Gen X and baby boomers. And 57% of US Gen Zers are getting more takeout, along with 40% of millennials versus 28% of Gen X and 24% of baby boomers. Now, for me, a millennial who got into the personal finance game in the mid-2010s, I can tell you that maybe the defining messaging for people my age about our money was that we would never own a home or retire because we were buying too much coffee and avocado toast.
When you're spending $40 a day on smashed avocado and coffees and not working, of course.
In fact, I have an oil painting of avocado toast in my living room for that very reason. And while it is very much an observable reality that younger adults have a very different relationship with food spending than their older counterparts, it's completely disingenuous to suggest that the only reason that Gen Z and millennials are not doing things like, for example, buying homes at the same pace or having children at the same pace as their parents did is because all their money went into TikTok viral foods. Even leaving aside how much wages have stagnated over the past few decades, all of the major markers of adult wealth building like education, home ownership, etc. have exploded in cost, even accounting for inflation. Quote, the median home price in the United States in 1950 was $7,354, a stark contrast to the median price of $431,000 in 2023. This significant difference, even when adjusted for inflation, translates to a 2023 median price of around $89,300 for a 1950s home. So essentially, the average home now is about 5 times as expensive as it should be if it were keeping pace with our parents' and grandparents' generation. So food, for young adults who have largely been locked out of the financial future that they were told was possible or even required of them, has become kind of an attainable status symbol. And it usually doesn't even have the same price barriers as things like clothing or travel, two other things that young adults spend on way more than their counterparts. And food is also a social connector, and it's an enjoyable activity in and of itself because, let's be clear, who doesn't love buying delicious and often pre-made food rather than going through the drudgery of cooking it? And with the proliferation of food delivery apps, we are never more than a few taps away from whatever it is we want to eat at any given moment. Something that, literally even like medieval kings didn't have access to. Well, I guess that's not true. Like, we now have our own version of like sending a peasant to go get, a good or sundry for us. Yeah, so I guess we're like on par with medieval kings. But combined with the algorithmic race to the bottom of social media platforms, this conspicuous consumption of food has kind of spawned its own subgenre of content, where millions and millions of daily viewers are tuning into overabundant, I would say often borderline pornographic displays of food consumption. Enter the mukbang. Originating in South Korea in the late 2000s, mukbang started as the simple recording of oneself eating, initially as a way to form connections and eat together with viewers while still technically eating alone. Over the past decade, though, and especially on platforms like TikTok, the original format of eating an appetizing looking, if relatively normal meal has been superseded by videos of creators eating thousands or tens of thousands of calories of hyper-processed, often fast food for the camera, often in intentionally messy ways, and disturbingly often often while visibly gaining substantial amounts of weight. Now, these videos and their creators rack up millions of views, thousands of subscribers, and often even more trolls. The comment sections of these videos are often full of, if not outright dominated by, incredibly harsh and demeaning words, a cycle of attacking and defending these creators that pushes their content to new algorithmic highs. And while the content is often very suggestive in itself, the ways in which people are eating and showing themselves, many of these creators are often explicitly courting a subset of their viewership, who want to see them intentionally gain weight, who want to see them eat more unhealthy quantities of food, or just generally abuse their bodies. Now, food and mukbang content, like much of our hyperconsumption content, lives at the specific nexus of aspiration and disgust. Because let's be clear, even if these videos are still very popular, I think for most of us, watching the hyperconsumption of things like clothes, Stanley cups, home goods, cleaning supplies, and all of the other things that we are constantly seeing consumed on social media does still give us the ick a little bit, and we do still know it's wrong on some level. But with food in particular, there's the added taboo, because when someone is buying and consuming tens of thousands of calories of nutritionally void, calorically dense food, we know that this is not good for their bodies. But unlike some of the more expensive forms of consumer spending, like travel or home decor or clothes, much of what we're seeing in this content is replicable, because we can get 4 family meals from McDonald's and eat them alone in our rooms. Or we could order a 6-pack of crumble cookies averaging nearly 1,000 calories each. What are they putting in those cookies? And we've even started seeing some of the same consumerist language used in many of this non-food content, with massive orders from fast food chains being referred to as hauls. Food has taken on a very unique role in our hyper-consumerist environment. It's amongst the most attainable luxuries, and yet often what we're seeing people consume is still way out of step with the average American budget. In fact, a very popular subgenre of comments on videos like this is, how do you get all the money to be ordering every single day? And food is a necessity for life, and yet the way we're often seeing it consumed and the type of food being consumed is almost completely incompatible with our actual nutritional needs. And it's also impossible to overstate the toxic role that watching people eat enormous quantities of food plays in an era where weight loss obsession has reached a new peak, in part thanks to the ubiquity and in many cases abuse of GLP-1 medications. Because let's be clear, while more people than ever are almost physically unable to eat, watching a select group of people stuff themselves with unsafe quantities of food has become a kind of crude vicarious entertainment. And the simultaneous era of thin is in returning, with binge eating content more popular than ever, is a very fascinating example of how our hyperconsumption era both creates and then exploits our obsession with our physical appearances. But on that note, speaking of how hyperconsumerism and beauty happen to perfectly intersect on our literal faces, let's talk about our era of #skincare. With Chapter 4, how the hyperconsumption model took over our skin. So we are not just buying more clothes and food than ever before, we've also entered an era where we are more obsessed with beauty and specifically with anti-aging than we've essentially ever been. Millennials and Gen Z in particular are spending a lot of money on beauty and skincare. Here are just a few findings from a Lending Tree survey. Quote, 3/4 of Americans say beauty products, cosmetics, and services are important to them, as proven by consumers spending an average of $1,754 a year on related purchases. But that rises with younger generations to an average of $2,670 among millennials and $2,048 among Gen Z. Across generations, most of this spending is on skin, 30%, and hair, 30%, and while 33% of consumers have regretted overspending on beauty products, that figure rises to 52% amongst Gen Z and 40% amongst millennials. And furthermore, 27% of both of those generations have gone into debt as a result of this beauty spending, and more than 4 in 10 Americans agree that social media has contributed to them spending more on beauty products than they would have otherwise, with 67% of millennials and 64% of Gen Z agreeing. And thanks to trends on places like TikTok, there is always a new way in which we can be spending on our faces, specifically in the name of looking perfect and avoiding aging. I mean, like, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but lately there's a whole new thing of your morning shed, which let's just look at this. People are sleeping like this. People are sleeping like this. I'm sorry, like, maybe this is just a me thing, but the idea of sleeping with like 7 different things strapped over my face and my mouth taped shut, like, it scares me so much. Like, first of all, it seems dangerous, but also so unpleasant. Like, sleep is the best part of my day. Why would I in any way diminish that experience? And as of 2022, the global anti-aging market is valued at $67.2 billion, which is projected to increase to $93 billion by 2027. And the idea of anti-aging, of continuing to look young even as you get older, is not new, but the overwhelming abundance of anti-aging products or services, as well as the obsession with preventative anti-aging amongst young people, definitely is. I mean, to go back to these like man in the iron mask looking setups that people are going to bed in, 90% of what you're seeing here is intended to do things like reduce wrinkles, prevent wrinkles, and generally make people look younger when they wake up. Also, I just have to say this, we can't keep selling people these snake oil products to snatch their jawlines. In how many ways can one person snatch a jawline? Like if it's really that deep, just save up and get a facelift in a couple years, because I promise you, those little rocks you're rubbing on your face, wearing like a jock strap around your face to go to bed at night, like it was never that serious. You can live with your jawline unsnatched. Also, I would really love to see just like a double-blind study of like how much of this stuff is actually producing results versus people just perceiving it that way because like when they very first take it off in the morning, it maybe looks a little bit more compressed. Anyway, those morning shed videos depressed me profoundly. And when it comes to anti-aging, there is a particularly scary relationship that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are developing, and their obsession with perfect skin is leading to unnecessary and even sometimes damaging beauty routines, especially when you consider that the oldest Gen Alpha babies are only about 14 years old and the youngest have not even been born. Not only can you find hundreds of thousands of get ready with me videos from adults with dozens of products with dubious skincare claims, you can now find videos of actual children making these videos, some of whom are using the same pricey Sephora products used by people their parents' ages. And dermatologists are legitimately worried about what this is doing to young people's skin and their emotional well-being. Quote, when kids use anti-aging skincare, they can actually cause premature aging, destroy the skin barrier, and lead to permanent scarring, says Brooke Jeffy, MD, a Scottsdale, Arizona dermatologist who has posted her own social media videos rebutting influencers' advice. More than physical harm, parents and child psychologists worry about the trend's effect on girls' mental health for years to come. Extensive data suggests that a fixation on appearance can affect self-esteem and body image and fuel anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. And this obsession with skincare is only aggravated by our constant framing of it as a marker of personal discipline and commitment and responsibility. Because now that we're at least somewhat pulling back the curtain on the actual effort and time and money that is required to implement many of these routines, the people who are prioritizing these things are being rewarded in our society for doing so. There are now articles with titles like How to Stay Hot, outlining the multiple thousands of dollars one should expect to spend in every decade of life to maintain a standard of beauty. Or celebrities will be sorted into problematic and unproblematic categories based on how effective their anti-aging treatments have been. And if you'd like a very thorough breakdown on how looking a certain way, especially as we age, confers huge economic benefits, I'll direct you over to our previous video essay about how you're not ugly, you're just poor. When we think about the most egregious examples of hyperconsumption, again, things like hoarders, we can so easily see the way in which these consumption habits are actively hurting them, the way they often achieve the exact opposite of their goal, and the way that consumption often begets more consumption by necessity. And it's a micro example, but literal children, teenagers, young adults, damaging their faces and their bodies via unnecessary procedures and products is not that far off. We are selling them a very explicit message that how they look is who they are, and that there's essentially no limit to the consumption that's justified in pursuit of that perfection. But if we're going to talk about ways that the images we're seeing online are leading us to spend in ways that hurt us, we couldn't talk about it without mentioning Chapter 5, getting the photo or video culture. So we've touched on this in our video about Gen Z becoming the buy everything own nothing generation, but it needs to be said here. Our fixation with spending on experiences is turning us into an even more hyper-consumerist society than we already were. This is especially apparent with what I'm calling, quote, getting the photo culture, doing things because you saw them on social media to show that you too did them. Now, the increased visibility from social media can certainly do wonders for smaller local businesses, but that kind of exposure is a double-edged sword. Once enough influencers start sharing content from individual restaurants or Instagram-worthy destinations, specific hotels, or even specific Airbnb listings, this inevitably leads to exhaustion and dilution. This problem has gotten so out of hand that there are actually places in Paris and elsewhere that have banned social media content outright, like the ice cream and wine shop. It has contributed to objectively beautiful places like Positano becoming completely overrun with tourists, to the point of, in certain peak seasons, being almost unable to walk in, and therefore not even close to the luxury experience you think you're paying for. From a 2022 article in Vox about visiting post-pandemic Positano, quote, crowds are rampant and inescapable and at times contribute to a sense of claustrophobic doom so great that the only way out is divorcing yourself from your body and disassociating until you finally reach open air. What's most disturbing about being in Positano is the knowledge that you have been suckered, and the realization that just because you have the means to go somewhere does not mean that you are owed anything more than the experiential equivalent of flying basic economy. Now, a huge part of this is that, like with fast fashion and other industries, the travel experience has been hyper-diluted so as to make it hyper-financially accessible and therefore often overconsumed. And it's true that flying, for example, used to be a much higher quality experience for all passengers, but that was because it was a much more expensive thing. And this is thanks in part to the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Quote, in 1941, an average flight from Los Angeles to Boston would have cost more than $5,000 in today's money and taken an excruciating 15 hours. Now, a nonstop one-way flight from Los Angeles to Boston commonly costs around $300 and takes about 6 hours, and an average domestic round-trip airfare is about $400 in the US. Now, in this case, I think two things can be true at once. It is probably an objective good that more people are able to travel, that it's not an exclusive luxury for the ultra-wealthy. I mean, for example, as someone who lives an ocean away from half of the closest people in her life, it is certainly a nice benefit for me that I get to see them more than I otherwise would have. But on the flip side, I do think travel is still an enormous privilege that this hyper-consumerist dilution has led us to take for granted. Because social media-fueled travel FOMO is making us spend more, trying to go to more places, while having a worse time because the places that we see in dreamy TikToks are actually overrun with tourists. And another aspect of the getting the photo culture is the home makeover industrial complex, and its need to create a sellable home being more important than a personal one. Now, there's a very specific relationship that millennials like myself have with home overconsumption, thanks to popular home decor shows on HGTV and TLC, as well as essentially every suburban millennial's ultimate obsession with shopping at Target. This has manifested in a sad sort of sameness in many Americans' approach to home decor and creating a home, the obsession with short-term and resale value and having a home that looks good to others rather than the long-term cultivation of a real home. It's become such a dominant force in millennial homeownership that the millennial gray home has become a trend in and of itself, now one that you mostly see in the context of being mocked on TikTok by younger people. And you know what? You're right. The sad gray homes are awful. But flipping culture has resulted in many Americans not seeing their homes as long-term investments, leading to short-sighted trends like bigger but cheaper houses, millennial gray walls, that god-awful gray fake wood flooring that I hope spontaneously burst into flames, subway tile and shiplap walls, inescapable open concepts, wasteful DIY micro-trends that get thrown out after less than a year, those horrendous sliding barn doors that people sometimes even put on bathrooms, which I find to be the most baffling experience. Like, have you ever gone to a bathroom? Have you ever been near a bathroom? Like, why in the world would you want a door that doesn't close? But from one article by author Amanda Mull in The Atlantic, quote, in real estate listings, these changes are frequently called updates, which is notably not the same thing as an upgrade. If you look closely, you can see where you're getting fooled. Is open shelving really a chic minimalist alternative to bulky upper cabinets, or is it just much less expensive than replacing the old outdated uppers that the demo guys ripped out? Tiny mosaic glass tiles look delicate, but they come in sheets that make quick work of the bathroom and can help disguise a multitude of installation sins. Laminate flooring is much cheaper than hardwood and considerably less repairable and adaptable. Unlike real wood, luxury vinyl can't be refinished in another color when trends change. And it's very interesting that these trends are still so prevalent when juxtaposed with the fact that house flipping is not even the investment that it used to be. Quote, in 2016, it netted an average ROI of 49.2%, and in 2023, ROI was 27.5%. But essentially, getting the photo culture has seeped even into homeownership, because we are now being trained to view homes not just as something that we're displaying on social media, but ultimately displaying to other potential buyers. And when we're more concerned with the aesthetics or sellability of something, we're much less invested in its long-term quality or utility. And even pop culture is not exempt from this getting the photo culture. Concerts and music festivals are now must-see events, with crowds reaching dangerously high numbers and dynamic pricing algorithms that automatically drive up ticket costs when demand increases. I know that I'm wading into dangerous stan territory here, but it must be said, Taylor Swift's business strategy is following the hyperconsumption/getting the content model, with plenty of other artists following in her footsteps. The constant re-releasing of albums, the micro versions of things that necessitate multiple purchases, including multiple editions of the exact same album on vinyl, the endless touring, the updated versions of the tour, like when she added a section to the Eras show to incorporate songs from her newest album, the release of touring movies with the then updated versions of the tour movies that get re-released, etc. It has spun into an endless feedback loop of FOMO-fueled scarcity, where fans never feel like they've gotten the full experience. And one only needs to have been at a concert in the last couple years to understand that for a huge amount of the attendees, it's more important to be filming most, if not all, of the content than to be actually enjoying it with your own eyes and ears. And when you consider now how many concerts have an expected culture of buying a specific outfit or creating one just for the purposes of the concert, which then of course gets shared on social media along with footage from the concert itself, we see how much of a symbiotic relationship is created from these various industries that are all driving us to hyperconsume. But when it comes to the similarities between our hyperconsumerist culture and the extremes that are sometimes portrayed on shows like Hoarders as being so far removed from the way normal people live, perhaps no example is more perfect than our final chapter, the tyranny of restock culture. Now, hyperconsumption has caused us to believe that we don't need high-quality individual items, we simply need a lot of everything. So it's really no surprise that Restock With Me videos have really taken off in the past few years. From a Washington Post article, quote, "In July 2022, the trend had become so popular that TikTok addressed it on its website, describing the videos as a certain kind of motivational, meditative entertainment that offers an aspirational contrast to our own personal methods of organization. Posts under the Restock hashtag have amassed more than 8 billion views, while some of TikTok's most famous restockers, such as Katherine Benson and Kaylee May, have upwards of 9 and 8 million followers respectively. We're obsessed with watching people restock their fridges, their pantries, their cars, their bathrooms, even guest bathrooms, perhaps because of the satisfying ASMR sounds, because who does not love all that click-clacking? I certainly do. But probably even more so because all of these videos have one thing in common, an excess of stuff.
The restock videos on social media, I do think that there is an element of it that is aspirational, like, or that's how it tries to play. It tries to play as this aspirational thing of you should always have a fridge that with these clear bins that's stocked. You know, your Stanley isn't just your Stanley anymore. It's got, you know, the cover and this container and that container that you can put your hand sanitizer in and your phone and like all these things. I just think the restock videos, again, they have taken the consumption up to a whole new level, right? Whether it's with food, it's with, you know, ice cube collections, it's with stocking stuff in your car, it's, you know, basically like packing up your Stanley like you're going on, you know, an overnight trip. So the restock videos are unhinged. That's how I think about them. And I think too that again, a lot of the times we view them as aspirational, but I do think you really have to start to question, like, why is this actually healthy? Like, why are we looking at this in an aspirational manner? Because there really is something about it that is actually very unhealthy, right? And it's kind of just like a different version of hoarding, but it looks better. It's prettier. It's aesthetic, but it's spun in a way to make you think like, oh, this is something that I should be aspiring to. Like my fridge should look like this, or my pantry should look like this, or I need to have this like cute little pack in my car with like all of these things, like just in case, you know what I mean?
Now, does anyone actually need the kind of consumption that we are frequently seeing in these videos? Probably not. But are they the logical conclusion of our predisposed psychology to want more and more and more, as well as the extremely effective marketing of the brands manufacturing these products? Absolutely. They follow a satisfyingly simple logic. If having one flavored syrup in your home coffee bar is a good thing, well, having a dozen of them must be better. And aesthetics, as well as the performance of wealth, are also a huge part of their appeal. For example, it is very common in these videos to see products being decanted into other containers, and we're often talking about them going from one plastic container to the other, because that allows for uniformity and aesthetic appeal. Yes, you may argue that in certain limited foods, like for example, foods that quickly go stale, it's better to put them in a sealed container, but we're often seeing people decant things like Tide Pods, or sprinkles, or liquids like milk and juice, which already famously come in their own perfectly usable containers.
One that I see that is pretty sneaky because it's very justifiable to us in our minds are these videos and this kind of category of influencer that it's more of like a lifestyle influencer where they're showing you everything in their life, but it's these pages where they show you cleaning their kitchens or cleaning their bathrooms or restocking this area of their home or restocking that area of their home. And the reason why these can be really sneaky is because they are presented to you like all of these things will make your life easier. All of these things will deliver convenience into your world and ultimately will save you time or, make your house cleaner or just kind of like, again, kind of turn you into this like aspirational version of yourself where everything is always clean. You're always caught up in the laundry. Everything is always like perfectly organized. Something that I hear, and this is a category that I hear a lot from the women that I work with. It's this category. It's the category of stuff where they can very easily justify and convince themselves, this will make my life easier, or this will make me a better fill in the blank. Like this will make me a better mom. It will make me a better employee. It will make me more productive. It will save me time. Like, so it's just kind of this like convenience, productivity type of content that is really sneaky because again, it's very easy for us to easily justify that. And then, it's all just linked in the Amazon storefront, right? All you got to do is just like boop on over to the profile and go to their Amazon storefront. And it's just all conveniently right there for you to click on and purchase.
And we cannot talk about restock culture without talking about what is perhaps the apex of American hyper-consumerist obsession, the Stanley Cup. Now, I'm saying this for accountability, right? I own a Stanley Cup. Now, I would like to specify that I own exactly one Stanley Cup, and it came into our household for free. My husband got it in a swag bag at work, so I'm happy to report that I paid $0 for this. And you know what? Listen, I've made fun of Stanley Cups in my day, but the girlies were right. I've never been so hydrated. I'm constantly hydrated. It's like a little adult sippy cup. I feel like a giant toddler, and I love reaching over in the middle of the night and having a sip of my ice cold water. I like just like, taking a swig all the time throughout the day. It's a good product, no denying that. But the culture around Stanley Cups, the conspicuous consumption of them, the collecting of them, and perhaps most insanely, the accessorizing of them has become something that makes me frankly embarrassed to leave the house with a Stanley Cup. I'm getting a report that children get bullied for having off-brand Stanleys, which is a kid who once got bullied for having off-brand Uggs. They'll find one of these in every generation, and I'm sorry that yours happens to be these really heavy cups. And listen, Stanley Cups are pretty specific, but I do think that they're a very apt illustration of just how far our hyper-consumer culture has gone. Everyone is obsessed with their Stanley water tumblers, myself included. And Stanleys themselves aren't cheap. I don't even think that they're a bad purchase. They work really well, last for a long time, and for me have an extremely low cost per use. Well, I guess my cost per use is in the negative because I didn't pay for this thing to begin with, but you know what I mean. But the culture surrounding Stanleys is the pinnacle of cheapness. It's not enough to have one Stanley that you carry everywhere. You have to have multiple colors to go with different outfits. And there's an entire cottage industry on places like Amazon of plastic and silicone accessories specifically made to adorn Stanley water tumblers. If you search Stanley Cup accessories on Amazon, you'll see pages and pages of results with everything from carriers with straps for a cup that already comes with a handle, to ring holder attachments, to novelty straw covers, to perfectly Stanley-sized ice cubes. And listen, I love ice cubes. One day, my lifelong dream is to get a Pebble ice machine. I can't currently have one in my home because my kitchen's too small. But I get the love for ice, but come on. You can fit any kind of ice in here. What the hell? There's even a product page for cowboy hat-shaped straw covers that currently have over 1,400 product reviews. In fact, this trend is so popular that Pack My Stanley With Me videos have started trending on TikTok, with some of them gaining tens of millions of views. And the fact that these videos are clearly rage bait on some level arguably makes this cheapness even more sinister, because people know that they can capitalize on rage-induced views from people who see through consumerism, which in turn puts it in front of more and more people who might actually be susceptible to buying what the videos are selling. There's always a new and insane home organization or decor trend, like the current fridge-scaping, hoarding, which sounds like, among other things, Mold City, designed to make us feel like we're doing something wrong or don't have enough of what we need to keep us stuck in the scarcity loop of hyperconsumption. Now, I want to take it all the way back to the very beginning of this conversation. My intention in drawing parallels between shows like Hoarders and the way that we're currently living in so many aspects of our life is not to demonize people for making these choices. Because not only do I think it's a completely understandable response when you combine our own psychology with the marketing environment we live in, it's to remind ourselves that the difference between consumption that we view as aspirational and consumption that we view as disgusting, it's often just a matter of the wealth and beauty of the person engaging in it. I think we need more empathy for people who get caught in these cycles, whether or not it happens to be aesthetically appealing, and that we all need, all of us, myself included, to frequently check in with ourselves and interrogate our own consumer habits to see where we may be spiraling way far away from the concept of need or even happiness, and into a feedback loop that only leaves us wanting more, and at least emotionally having less.
Just know that this change takes time. Like it seriously, it took me years. And what you also have to recognize is, again, like, not only is it a difficult thing to do from just a behavior and a habit perspective, you're also trying to make these changes while living in a world that goes against all of these changes that you're trying to make, right? You're just going to be inundated with it every single day. So just patience with yourself, grace with yourself, be kind. It takes time, but just slow, sustainable changes over time. That's how we do it.
Because let's be clear, with the way millennials and Gen Z are consuming and the kinds of products we're being sold, none of us are that far away from ending up in a giant home full of garbage. In fact, I would argue that a lot of us already live there. And when so many of us are going into credit card debt to maintain this lifestyle, it's all the more urgent that we take a look around and start to feel, I think, an appropriate level of disgust for the people and cultures that are constantly selling this way of living. In fact, in some ways, I feel less disgusted when I watch an episode of Hoarders than when I watch a Fashion Nova haul. Because at least in one case, we're talking about a mental illness that spiraled out of control. In the other case, we're talking about a pretty opportunistic shilling of a brand to intentionally get other people to buy so much that they don't need. And I am certainly not a minimalist, and I think that often the messaging around anti-consumption can be kind of judgy and ostracizing and not lead people to feel welcome to make better choices. I think for most of our choices, we're talking in shades of harm reduction because the truth is we're all over-consuming at some level. But for me, the first step to combating hyperconsumption in every area of our lives is to realize that it's not so far from the shameful and stigmatized imagery of people who consumed themselves into a living prison. Our walk-in closets might be more organized, but they're still full of worthless plastic. As always, everyone, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you back here for our next video essay. Bye.